Trevor Vossen and Lauren Creed Jenkins. In the summer of 2018, Wheeling, West Virginia became the site of a particularly disturbing case. Trevor Vossen, 27, and his girlfriend Lauren Creed Jenkins, 28, were a couple known in local circles. Lauren was pregnant at the time, expecting their first child together. The couple had their whole future ahead of them. However, someone had other plans. The couple was last seen alive in early August 2018. Family members reported them missing on August 3rd when they could not reach either Trevor or Lauren. Initial searches of their usual locations turned up nothing. Police began investigating their last known contacts and activities. What emerged was a connection to a man named Gerald Wayne Jaco, 38 years old. Jaco had a history that included prior arrests. He also had a girlfriend, Dana Marie Bowman, who would become crucial to the investigation. According to investigators, Jaco had lured Trevor and Lauren to a house in Wheeling. The motive appeared to stem from a personal grudge. Court documents suggested Jaco believed the couple had wronged him in some way. What exactly had happened between them remained somewhat unclear, though it may have involved personal disputes or minor debts. Whatever the perceived slight, Jaco decided it warranted taking their lives. He shot both Trevor and Lauren at the house. What could drive someone to such extreme actions over a personal dispute? What happened next shocked even experienced investigators. Rather than simply leaving the scene or attempting to hide the bodies in a straightforward manner, Jaco took extreme measures. He dismembered both Trevor and Lauren. He then transported the remains to rural Raleigh County, far from Wheeling. Once there, he burned the remains in an apparent attempt to destroy all evidence. He buried what was left. These actions suggested a calculated effort to make identification impossible and to eliminate any trace of what he had done. 2 weeks after Trevor and Lauren were reported missing, investigators made a grim discovery along Sullivan Road in Raleigh County. They found charred, dismembered human remains. The condition of the remains made immediate identification challenging. However, forensic specialists were able to extract dental records and DNA. These confirmed the remains belonged to Trevor Vossen and Lauren Creed Jenkins. The couple who had been missing for 2 weeks had been found. But the circumstances were far worse than anyone had hoped. The investigation into how Gerald Jaco had carried out these acts and who else might have been involved intensified. Dana Marie Bowman, Jaco's girlfriend, who pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact, became a key witness. She cooperated with authorities and provided crucial information. She described how Jaco had lured the couple and what had happened at the house. Her testimony implicated Jaco in the shooting, the dismemberment, and the subsequent burning and burial of the remains. Forensic analysis confirmed her account. Evidence showed the victims had suffered gunshots and trauma before being dismembered. Arson residue linked the burning to Jaco's methods. Gerald Jaco was charged with 3 counts of taking life. The charges included both Trevor and Lauren, as well as their unborn child. He also faced charges for concealing bodies. The case moved toward trial. In August 2023, after a multi-day trial, a jury found Gerald Jaco guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of concealing a deceased human body. He did not plead guilty, but was convicted by the jury. On January 30th, 2024, Ohio County Circuit Judge David Sims sentenced Gerald Jaco to 2 concurrent life terms without possibility of parole. This sentence came on top of an existing 100-year sentence Jaco had already received for armed robbery. Prosecutor Sean Adkins spoke during the sentencing, emphasizing the importance of closure for the families. He noted that the sentence delivered finality to the Vossen and Jenkins families after years of waiting for justice. As of 2026, Gerald Wayne Jaco remains incarcerated at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. The case drew attention beyond West Virginia, including coverage on True Offense podcasts. The extreme nature of the dismemberment and burning made it particularly disturbing. For the families of Trevor Vossen and Lauren Cree Jenkins, the conviction brought some measure of justice, though it could never bring back their loved ones or the child who was never born. Another case would unfold in broad daylight at a public location. Kami Ryder. Pocahontas County is known for its serene landscapes and small communities. On February 12, 2024, that serenity was shattered when 21-year-old Kami Ryder was shot in the parking lot of a little general convenience store in Marlinton. The incident occurred in broad daylight at a busy location where people regularly stopped for gas and groceries. Kami worked at Snowshoe Mountain Resort and was known as a devoted mother to her son. The person responsible was Kami's ex-boyfriend, Mason Slava Walker, 25 years old, from Hillsboro. Mason and Kami had a son together, but their relationship had become troubled. They had recently ended their relationship. However, Mason was not accepting the breakup well. There had been prior incidents between them, documented as domestic situations by authorities. These conflicts had been escalating. Friends and family of Kami had noticed concerning behavior from Mason. On that February day, Mason approached Kami at the convenience store parking lot. Witnesses were present in the area. What happened next occurred quickly. Mason shot Kami. The sound of gunfire in the parking lot shocked witnesses and passers-by. People immediately called for help. Kami was transported to Pocahontas Memorial Hospital. Medical staff worked to save her life. However, her injuries were too severe. Kami passed away from the gunshot wound. Could a public shooting in daylight lead to a quick arrest? After the shooting, Mason Walker fled the scene. He drove to nearby Randolph County. However, law enforcement responded rapidly. State police coordinated efforts to locate and apprehend him. Surveillance footage from the convenience store had captured the incident. Witnesses provided descriptions and information. By the end of the same day, February 12th, police had located and arrested Mason Walker in Randolph County. He was taken into custody without incident. Mason Walker was charged with first-degree taking of life. The charge reflected the seriousness of shooting someone in a public location. An autopsy confirmed that Kami had died from a fatal gunshot wound. Ballistics analysis matched the weapon to Mason. The evidence against him was substantial, given the public nature of the incident and the surveillance footage. The case moved through the legal system over the following months. On December 19, 2025, Mason Walker pleaded guilty to first-degree taking of life with mercy. The plea with mercy meant he acknowledged his responsibility while requesting consideration during sentencing. The court had to balance justice for Kami with the legal parameters of the plea. Judge Russell Cloggis presided over the sentencing. He sentenced Mason Walker to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years. This meant Mason would serve at least 15 years before he could be considered for release. The case was prosecuted by Raleigh County prosecutors due to a conflict of interest in Pocahontas County. This is common in small jurisdictions where connections between parties might compromise the proceedings. The involvement of outside prosecutors helped ensure the case was handled appropriately. Throughout the proceedings, no notable statements from Mason Walker were reported. He did not offer explanations or apologies publicly. Kami's family and community rallied together in the aftermath, with a fundraising campaign launched to help with expenses. The campaign highlighted the community's grief and the loss they felt. Cami had been a young mother with her whole life ahead of her. Her son was left without a mother. The case brought attention to ongoing issues with domestic situations in rural areas where resources for prevention and intervention can be limited. As of 2026, Mason Slava Walker remains incarcerated at a West Virginia state facility. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until 2040. The custody arrangements for the son he shared with Cami remain private. For Cami Ryder's family, the conviction brought accountability but could not fill the void left by her passing. The public nature of the incident and the swift arrest at least ensured that Mason faced consequences quickly. The next case would involve a betrayal between close friends. Skylar Neese. Star City, West Virginia seemed like a typical small town where everyone knew each other. In July 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese lived there with her parents. She attended University High School in Morgantown. Skylar had two best friends, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. The three girls were inseparable. They spent time together constantly and shared everything. However, beneath the surface of this friendship, tensions were building that would lead to one of West Virginia's most shocking cases. On the night of July 6, 2012, Skylar snuck out of her apartment to meet Sheila and Rachel. Surveillance cameras captured her getting into a car with them just after midnight. Her parents discovered she was missing the next morning. Initially, they assumed she had run away or was staying with friends. However, as hours turned into days with no contact, they became increasingly concerned. They reported her missing to authorities. Police began investigating her disappearance. Sheila and Rachel were questioned as Skylar's closest friends. They claimed they had dropped Skylar off at the end of the street after driving around. They said she had gotten into another car and driven away. This story seemed plausible at first. However, investigators noticed inconsistencies in their accounts. The two girls gave slightly different versions of events when questioned separately. Their behavior also seemed off. They appeared nervous and evasive when asked specific questions about that night. Could best friends really be hiding what happened to Skylar? Months passed with no sign of Skylar. The case remained open, but seemed to be going cold. Then, on January 3, 2013, 6 months after Skylar's disappearance, Rachel Schoaf had a breakdown. She confessed to her attorney and her parents. She admitted that she and Sheila Eddy had taken Skylar's life. The revelation shocked everyone who knew the girls. Rachel led authorities to a wooded area near Brave, Pennsylvania, just across the state line from West Virginia. There, investigators found Skylar's remains. The details Rachel provided were disturbing. She and Sheila had driven Skylar to the remote location. They had planned what would happen. On a count of 3, they both attacked Skylar with knives. Forensic examination would later confirm that Skylar had been stabbed over 50 times. The sustained nature of the attack showed determination from both girls. DNA evidence linked both Rachel and Sheila to the scene. The question everyone asked was why? What could possibly motivate two teenagers to take their best friend's life? The motive, that the girls feared Skylar would reveal a romantic encounter she had witnessed between them, was actually revealed by Rachel Schoaf during her initial confession to investigators in early 2013, long before her 2023 parole hearing. They feared Skylar would expose their relationship to others. In the conservative small-town environment, they believed this exposure would ruin their lives. Rather than deal with the possibility, they decided to eliminate the perceived threat. This revelation finally provided answers to Skylar's family after 11 years of partial understanding. Both girls were charged as adults, despite being teenagers at the time. Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree taking of life on May 1, 2013. She was sentenced on February 26, 2014, to 30 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Sheila Eddy initially denied involvement, but eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree taking of life on January 24, 2014. She received life in prison with parole eligibility after 15 years. During her sentencing, Rachel Schoaf expressed remorse, saying she was sorry for what she had done. However, for Skylar's parents, particularly her father Dave Neese, the apology meant little. He later expressed relief at finally knowing the real reason behind his daughter's passing after 11 years. As of 2026, both Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy remain incarcerated at Lakin Correctional Center. Rachel Schoaf's first parole hearing took place in May 2023, where it was denied. Her next eligibility for parole is currently set for May 2026. Another case would remain a mystery for 80 years. Sodder children. Christmas Eve, 1945 should have been a joyful time for the Sodder family in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children, and the family ran a successful trucking business. George was an Italian immigrant who had come from Sardinia. He had strong opinions and was known for speaking out against Mussolini, which had made him some enemies in the Italian-American community. That Christmas Eve, the family went to bed not knowing their lives were about to change forever. In the early hours of Christmas morning, a fire broke out at the Sodder home. The house was quickly engulfed in flames. George and Jenny managed to escape with 4 of their children. However, 5 children remained trapped upstairs. Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 10, Jenny, who was 8, and Betty, who was 5. George attempted to rescue them, but could not reach the upper floor. He tried to use ladders to access the second story, but the ladders were mysteriously missing from their usual locations. He attempted to drive his trucks to use them to reach the windows, but neither vehicle would start, despite having worked fine the day before. The fire department was notoriously slow to respond, arriving several hours after the fire had already self-extinguished and consumed the home. The delay was partly due to the fire chief's inability to find a driver for the truck. By then, the house was completely destroyed. The family and authorities searched through the ashes and debris for the remains of the 5 children. However, nothing was found. No bones, no teeth, no remnants of the children at all. This was highly unusual. Even in intense fires, human bones typically survive to some degree. Forensic experts would later note that a house fire does not usually burn hot enough or long enough to completely destroy human remains, especially those of children. Could 5 children simply vanish without any trace in a house fire? An initial inquest ruled the fire had been caused by an electrical fault. However, George Sodder was not convinced. He began investigating on his own. He discovered several suspicious circumstances surrounding the fire. The telephone lines had been cut before the fire started. A strange man had been seen watching the house in the days before Christmas. Someone had tried to sell George life insurance shortly before the fire. And when George refused, the man had made threatening comments about George's house going up in smoke and his children being destroyed. Additionally, witnesses reported seeing the children in the days and weeks after the fire. Though these sightings were never confirmed, George and Jenny became convinced their children had been taken rather than perished in the fire. They believed the fire had been set deliberately as a cover for the disappearance. Their theory centered on George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and the Italian fascist regime. They wondered if members of the local Italian community with different political views had taken revenge by having the children abducted. The family hired private investigators who claimed to have found evidence supporting the theory of a planned event rather than an accident. In 1968, the family received a photograph in the mail. The photograph showed a young man who resembled what Louis Sauter might look like as an adult. On the back of the photo was written information suggesting it was indeed Louis and that he was alive. However, the family was never able to verify the authenticity of the photograph or locate the person shown in it. This mystery photograph gave them hope, but also added to their anguish. For decades, George and Jenny Sauter maintained a billboard along Route 60 asking for information about their children. The billboard displayed photographs of the 5 missing children and offered a reward for information. Jenny Sauter was quoted as saying the family only wanted proof one way or the other about what had happened to the children. George passed away in 1969 and Jenny in 1989, both without ever knowing the truth. The famous Sauter billboard, which became a landmark of grief in Fayetteville, was finally taken down in 1989 following the death of Jenny Sauter, who had maintained it faithfully for over 40 years. As of 2026, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests were ever made. No definitive evidence was ever found to prove either that the children perished in the fire or that they were taken. The last surviving sibling from the fire passed away in 2021. Family members, including descendants, continue to research the case and maintain online forums dedicated to finding answers. The 80th anniversary in 2025 brought renewed attention. However, with so much time passed and key witnesses gone, resolution seems increasingly unlikely. The Sauter children case remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. The next case would involve a witness who saw everything unfold. Morgan Lee Stutler Lott. In July 2024, Vienna, West Virginia became the site of a particularly tragic domestic case. 22-year-old Morgan Lee Stutler Lott was a young mother living in an apartment in the area. She had a young child who depended on her. Morgan had been in a relationship that had become troubled. Prior complaints had been filed documenting concerning situations between Morgan and her partner, Earl Thomas Collins. Earl Thomas Collins was originally from Harrison County. He had been living a somewhat transient lifestyle, though specific details about his background remained limited in public records. What was clear was that his relationship with Morgan had deteriorated into repeated conflicts. These conflicts had escalated over time. Friends and family of Morgan had noticed bruises and other signs of physical harm. However, Morgan had been reluctant to completely end the relationship, a pattern common in such situations. On July 20th, 2024, the situation reached its tragic conclusion. Earl Collins shot Morgan in their Vienna apartment. The shooting occurred in the presence of Morgan's young child. The child witnessed what happened, but was physically unharmed. Neighbors heard the gunshot and called police. When authorities arrived at the apartment, they found Morgan with a fatal head wound. She also had other injuries, including bruises that suggested prior physical confrontations. Medical responders attempted to save her life, but she passed away from her injuries. Could a child witness provide crucial testimony in such a case? After shooting Morgan, Earl Collins fled the scene. He did not remain to face what he had done. Police immediately began searching for him. They issued warrants for his arrest. They coordinated with law enforcement in surrounding counties. Collins had ties to Harrison County, which made it a logical place for him to flee. Investigators worked to track his movements and potential locations where he might try to hide. The investigation moved quickly. Forensic examination of the scene confirmed the gunshot wound as the cause of Morgan's passing. The weapon used was identified. The presence of the child witness, while tragic, provided investigators with information about what had occurred. Authorities also reviewed the history of prior complaints and incidents between Morgan and Collins. This history established a pattern of escalating conflict and harm that culminated in the fatal shooting. Within days, law enforcement located and arrested Earl Thomas Collins in Harrison County. He was taken into custody and charged with first-degree taking of life. The charge reflected the serious nature of shooting someone in their own home. The case proceeded through the legal system over the following year. The evidence against Collins was substantial. The child witness, forensic evidence, the history of prior incidents, and his flight after the shooting all pointed to his responsibility. In July 2025, Earl Thomas Collins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge specifically noted the trauma inflicted on the child as an aggravating factor that removed any consideration for mercy. The sentence ensured he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The judge who handed down the sentence considered the brutality of the act, the presence of the child witness, and the pattern of prior harm toward Morgan. These factors all contributed to the severity of the sentence. As of 2026, Earl Thomas Collins remains in a West Virginia correctional facility. The child who witnessed the shooting has been placed in appropriate care, though details about the child's current situation remain protected for privacy reasons. The trauma the child experienced has been acknowledged by authorities and mental health professionals involved in the case. For Morgan Lee Stutler Lott's family, the conviction brought accountability, but could not bring Morgan back or undo the trauma inflicted on her child. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Another case would involve a weapon used in front of family members. Carrie Michelle Billings. Bluefield, West Virginia, became the site of a particularly disturbing domestic case in the summer of 2024. Carrie Michelle Billings was in a relationship with Charles Edward Dawson, who lived in the Bluefield area. The couple had been together for some time, though their relationship had shown signs of trouble. Carrie had family members who cared about her safety and were concerned about certain aspects of the relationship. What happened on June 8, 2024, would shock the community and highlight the dangers that can lurk in seemingly ordinary homes. Charles Edward Dawson was known to have a volatile personality. He had been dealing with personal issues and had shown concerning behavior patterns. On that June day, an argument erupted between Charles and Carrie at their residence. The specific trigger for the argument was not entirely clear, but witnesses later described it as escalating rapidly from a verbal dispute to something far more dangerous. What made the situation particularly horrific was the presence of family members, including young relatives. During the confrontation, Charles retrieved a firearm. The weapon was an AR-15 style rifle, a powerful weapon that would prove devastating in the enclosed space of the home. In front of the family members present, Charles shot Carrie Michelle Billings. The sound of the weapon discharging inside the home was deafening. Family members who witnessed the shooting were traumatized by what they saw. Carrie sustained fatal injuries from the shooting. Emergency services were called immediately, but by the time they arrived, it was too late to save her. How could someone use such a weapon in front of family members? Charles Dawson did not flee the scene after the shooting. He remained at the residence when police arrived. Officers took him into custody without incident. He was immediately charged with taking Carrie's life. The investigation began with interviews of the family members who had witnessed the shooting. Their testimony provided clear accounts of what had transpired. The witnesses described the argument, the retrieval of the weapon, and the fatal shooting. Their statements were consistent and detailed. Forensic examination of the scene confirmed the accounts provided by witnesses. The AR-15 rifle was recovered and analyzed. Ballistics testing matched the weapon to the injuries Carey sustained. An autopsy determined the cause of passing was gunshot wounds from the rifle. The medical examiner documented the extent of the trauma caused by the powerful weapon. The forensic evidence, combined with the eyewitness testimony, created an overwhelming case against Charles Dawson. The case proceeded to trial in the Mercer County court system. The prosecution presented the testimony from family members who had witnessed the shooting. They showed the forensic evidence linking the weapon to the fatal injuries. They established the relationship between Charles and Carey and the history of conflicts. The defense had limited options given the strength of the evidence. Charles Dawson did not testify on his own behalf. The jury heard all the evidence and deliberated on the verdict. In late 2025, Charles Edward Dawson entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder to avoid a jury trial, acknowledging the fatal shooting of Carey Billings that occurred in June 2024. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that the shooting had been intentional and not the result of any justifiable circumstances. The conviction carried serious sentencing implications. Judge William Sadler presided over the sentencing hearing. The judge considered the brutality of the act, the use of a powerful weapon, and the trauma inflicted on the family members who witnessed the shooting. Judge Sadler sentenced Charles Edward Dawson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This meant Dawson would never be eligible for release. He would spend the remainder of his natural life incarcerated. The sentence reflected the severity of taking a life in such a brutal manner and in front of family members. The judge noted that the presence of witnesses who would carry the trauma of what they saw for the rest of their lives was an aggravating factor in determining the appropriate sentence. As of 2026, Charles Edward Dawson remains incarcerated in the West Virginia Correctional System. He has no possibility of ever being released. The next case would involve two victims and claims of defense. Alicia Brooke Carnifex and Coda Bryson Jarrett. In December 2024, St. Albans, West Virginia became the scene of a double incident that would raise questions about relationships and motives. Alicia Brooke Carnifex and Coda Bryson Jarrett were found deceased in a residence in the area. The two victims had connections to a man named Marcus DeMario Guy. The exact nature of these relationships and the events leading up to their passing would become central to the investigation and subsequent trial. What appeared initially as a straightforward case would develop into a more complex situation involving claims and counterclaims. Marcus DeMario Guy was from the Charleston area and had been dealing with various personal issues. Background information suggested he had connections to both victims through relationships or acquaintances in the local community. The circumstances that brought all three individuals together on December 10, 2024, remain somewhat unclear from public records. However, what is known is that a confrontation occurred at the residence that day. During this confrontation, both Alicia and Coda were shot multiple times. When police responded to the scene, they found both victims with fatal gunshot wounds. Alicia Brooke Carnifex had been shot in the head multiple times. Coda Bryson Jarrett had also sustained multiple gunshot wounds to the head. The nature and placement of the wounds suggested deliberate targeting rather than random firing. Forensic examination confirmed both victims had died from the gunshot injuries. The weapon used was recovered at the scene and would become a key piece of evidence. Could multiple shots to the head be considered defensive actions? Marcus Guy was quickly identified as the suspect. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of taking life. The investigation involved examining the scene, interviewing potential witnesses, and analyzing forensic evidence. Investigators worked to establish a timeline of events and to understand the relationships between Guy and the victims. Phone records, social media communications, and witness statements helped build a picture of what had led to the fatal confrontation. The case went to trial in Kanawha County. The prosecution argued that Guy had shot both victims in a planned manner. They presented forensic evidence about the multiple headshots each victim received. They argued that the nature of the wounds and the number of shots fired indicated intentional action rather than a spontaneous, defensive response. The prosecution worked to establish motive based on the relationships between Guy and the victims. Though specific details about the motive were somewhat limited in public reporting. The defense team claimed that Guy had acted in defense of himself. They argued that he had been threatened or attacked and had responded to protect his own life. This defense strategy attempted to reframe the shooting as a justified response rather than a calculated taking of life. However, the prosecution countered that the number of shots fired and the targeting of vital areas contradicted a purely defensive scenario. The jury would have to weigh these competing narratives. After hearing all the evidence and arguments from both sides, the jury deliberated on the verdict. They ultimately rejected the defense claims. They found that the evidence supported the prosecution's theory that the shootings had been intentional rather than defensive. The multiple shots to each victim's head weighed heavily in their decision. A truly defensive shooting would likely not have involved such sustained targeting of fatal areas. The jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts of taking life. As of January 2026, Marcus Demario Guy is still awaiting trial in Kanawha County for the double homicide. While a trial date was set for late 2025, the complexity of the forensic evidence regarding the multiple headshots led to a continuance into early 2026. Another case would involve a confrontation over money. Dalian Lewis. In February 2024, Clarksburg, West Virginia became the site of a case involving multiple individuals and a dispute that escalated to fatal consequences. Dalian Lewis was found deceased on Jack Run Road after being shot. The circumstances surrounding his passing involved several people and what appeared to be a planned confrontation. The case would reveal connections between individuals from Ohio and West Virginia, and a dispute over what seemed like a relatively small amount of money that led to tragic consequences. The key figures in the case included Cameron Griffin, Dominique Thompson, and Leanna Griffin. Cameron and Dominique were from Ohio, but had connections to the Clarksburg area. The group had been involved in activities that brought them into contact with Dalian Lewis. According to investigation findings, there was a dispute over money. Specifically, the dispute centered on approximately $100 that one party believed was owed. This relatively small sum would become the catalyst for a deadly confrontation. On February 26, 2024, the situation came to a head. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, the group lured Dalian Lewis to a location on Jack Run Road. They used the pretext of settling the money dispute to get him to meet them. However, their actual intentions were far more sinister. When Dalian arrived at the location, he was ambushed. The confrontation occurred near or inside a vehicle. Multiple shots were fired during the incident. Could $100 really motivate such extreme actions? Dalian Lewis sustained multiple gunshot wounds. He was found in the trunk of a vehicle, suggesting his body had been moved after the shooting. Emergency responders and police arrived at the scene after receiving reports of the incident. Despite attempts to provide medical assistance, Dalian was pronounced deceased from his injuries. The forensic examination would later confirm he had been shot multiple times. The placement of the wounds and the location where his body was found suggested a calculated attack rather than a spontaneous confrontation. The investigation quickly focused on the 3 individuals who had been involved in luring Dalian to the location. Police worked to establish what each person's role had been in the incident. They conducted interviews, examined phone records, and analyzed forensic evidence from the scene and the vehicle. Dominique Thompson became a crucial witness for the prosecution. Thompson provided detailed testimony about what had occurred, including that Cameron Griffin had fired the fatal shots. All 3 individuals were arrested and charged in connection with Dalian Lewis's passing. The charges varied based on their roles in the incident. Cameron Griffin faced the most serious charges as the person who allegedly fired the shots. The cases proceeded through the Harrison County Court system. Thompson's cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a potentially reduced sentence provided key evidence about the planning and execution of the attack. Her testimony would prove crucial in securing convictions. The trials took place throughout 2025. The prosecution presented evidence about the dispute over money and how it had motivated the group to lure Dalian to the location. They showed how the attack had been planned rather than spontaneous. Thompson's testimony provided detailed accounts of conversations and actions leading up to the shooting. Forensic evidence corroborated key aspects of her testimony. The defense attorneys for the accused attempted to challenge the credibility of Thompson's testimony and to suggest alternative explanations for what had occurred. In August 2025, Cameron Griffin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Dalian Lewis, while his co-defendant, Leanna Griffin, received a sentence for her role as an accessory. The sentence reflected his role as the shooter in the fatal incident. Leanna Griffin also faced serious charges and received a substantial sentence for her participation in luring Dalian to the location and assisting in the attack. Dominique Thompson received a lesser sentence due to her cooperation with prosecutors, though she still faced prison time for her role in the incident. As of 2026, the convicted individuals remain incarcerated in various facilities within the West Virginia and possibly Ohio correctional systems. The next case would involve a disappearance and a shallow grave. Kimberly Osborne. In May 2024, Morgantown, West Virginia became the focus of a missing person investigation that would eventually become a case involving deception and concealment. Kimberly Osborne was reported missing by family members who had not heard from her in several days. Kimberly had been in a relationship with Joseph Navarra, a 51-year-old man who owned property in the Morgantown area. When police began investigating her disappearance, they quickly focused their attention on Navarra as a person of interest. His behavior and statements would raise serious red flags for investigators. When questioned by police about Kimberly's whereabouts, Joseph Navarra provided an alibi that he claimed would account for his activities during the relevant time period. He insisted he had nothing to do with Kimberly's disappearance. However, investigators were skeptical of his account. They began checking the details of his alibi and cross-referencing them with other evidence. What they discovered was concerning. Navarra's alibi did not hold up under scrutiny. There were inconsistencies in his timeline and contradictions in his statements. Police also learned that there had been prior issues in the relationship between Navarra and Kimberly. Witnesses reported that there had been arguments and tensions. Some individuals recalled Navarra making threatening statements about Kimberly. These reports added to investigators' suspicions that he was involved in her disappearance. The investigation expanded to include searches of properties associated with Navarra. Given that he owned land in the area, police obtained warrants to search these locations. Would a search of the property reveal the truth? In November 2024, 6 months after Kimberly had been reported missing, police made a grim discovery on property associated with Joseph Navarra. They found human remains in a shallow grave. The location and manner of burial suggested an attempt to conceal the body rather than a proper burial. Forensic examination and identification procedures confirmed the remains were those of Kimberly Osborne. The discovery transformed the missing person case into a homicide investigation. Forensic analysis of the remains and the burial site provided crucial evidence. Medical examiners worked to determine the cause of passing, though the decomposition that had occurred over 6 months made this challenging. The location of the grave on property connected to Navarra was significant evidence. The shallow nature of the grave and the attempt to conceal it indicated consciousness of wrongdoing. Investigators also examined the distance between where Kimberly was last seen and where her remains were found, which helped establish a timeline. On December 7, 2024, Joseph Navarra was arrested and charged with taking Kimberly Osborne's life. The charges were based on the discovery of the body on his property, the evidence that his alibi had been false, the prior threatening statements, and the attempts to conceal the remains. Shortly after his arrest on the state charges, federal authorities also became involved. Joseph Navarra, a convicted felon, faced federal charges for unlawful possession of a firearm found during the search for Kimberly Osborne, a charge that carried a significant mandatory minimum sentence alongside the state murder charges. Navarra appeared before a magistrate for a preliminary hearing. During this hearing, he waived his right to a full preliminary hearing, which meant the case would proceed directly to circuit court without the preliminary evidence being presented publicly. This decision prevented the public release of additional details about the evidence against him at that stage. The waiver suggested his legal team was not confident they could successfully challenge the probable cause for the charges. As of 2026, Joseph Navarra remains in custody, awaiting trial. The case is still in the pre-trial phase as both the prosecution and defense prepare their cases. The state charges for taking Kimberly's life will be the primary focus of the trial, though the federal weapon charge will also need to be resolved. Navarra is being held without bond given the severity of the charges and the concern that he poses a flight risk or danger to the community. The final case would involve a method that seemed like natural causes. Michael Cochran. In February 2019, Raleigh County, West Virginia became the site of what initially appeared to be a medical emergency, but would eventually be revealed as something far more sinister. Christopher Cochran, a father and husband, was found unresponsive in his home. The confusion often arises because Natalie was also convicted of the murder of her business partner, Michael Walker. Medical responders arrived and attempted to revive him, but he was pronounced deceased. His wife, Natalie Page Cochran, was present and appeared distraught. At first, there seemed to be no reason to suspect anything other than a tragic but natural passing. However, something about the circumstances would eventually trigger a deeper investigation. Natalie Page Cochran had been born in November 1980 in Raleigh County. She had grown up in a middle-class family and had pursued a career in pharmacy. She and Michael had married in the early 2000s and had 2 children together. On the surface, they appeared to be a successful family. Natalie's pharmacy career provided a good income, and Michael worked as well. However, beneath this appearance of normalcy, serious problems were developing that would eventually lead to tragedy. The initial cause of Michael's passing seemed unclear. He had not been known to have any serious health conditions that would explain a sudden passing. An autopsy was performed as part of routine procedures. The medical examiner conducted toxicology testing as part of the examination. What they discovered was shocking. Michael's system contained lethal levels of insulin. However, Michael did not have conditions that required insulin. He was not someone who would have been using or handling insulin in any legitimate medical capacity. How could someone without medical need have lethal insulin in their system? The discovery of the insulin immediately changed the investigation from a natural passing to a potential homicide. Investigators began looking into who would have had access to insulin and who might have had motive to harm Michael. Natalie's career as a pharmacist meant she had regular access to insulin and knowledge of its effects. This put her under immediate suspicion. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered information about Natalie's financial situation that provided a potential motive. It emerged that Natalie had been involved in financial schemes that had gone badly wrong. She had been operating what essentially amounted to a situation where she was taking money from some people to pay others, promising returns that were not sustainable. The total amount involved was approximately $2 million. By 2019, this scheme was on the verge of collapsing. People were demanding their money back. Natalie was facing potential exposure and legal consequences. Investigators theorized that she believed Michael's passing might provide her with financial relief through insurance or other means, or that it might serve as a distraction from her financial problems. Based on the toxicology findings, the financial motive, and Natalie's access to insulin through her pharmacy career, prosecutors charged her with taking Michael's life. The case proceeded toward trial. Natalie maintained her innocence, but the evidence against her was substantial. The prosecutor presented the toxicology reports showing the lethal insulin levels. They showed that Michael had no medical reason to have insulin in his system. They established Natalie's access to insulin through her work. They presented evidence of the financial schemes and the pressure she was under. The trial took place in September 2020, and Natalie Cochran was sentenced to life without mercy in early 2021. Following the conviction, Natalie's defense team filed a motion for acquittal, arguing that the evidence had not been sufficient to support the verdict. In February 2025, the judge denied the motion for acquittal. The judge found that the evidence had been sufficient for a reasonable jury to reach the guilty verdict. Natalie was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of mercy or parole. This meant she would spend the remainder of her life incarcerated with no possibility of release. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of using insulin to take someone's life and the betrayal involved in a spouse taking such action. As of 2026, Natalie Page Cochran remains incarcerated in the West Virginia Correctional System. The 2 children she and Michael had together have been placed in appropriate care. For Michael Cochran's family, the conviction brought justice, but also raised painful questions about how Natalie could have taken such actions against her husband. The use of insulin as the method made the case particularly disturbing, as it showed planning and the misuse of medical knowledge. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.